why and how did the United States become involved in Vietnam in the first place? 15 years ago, North Vietnam, with the logistical support of Communist China and the Soviet Union, launched a campaign to impose a communist government on South Vietnam by instigating and supporting a revolution. In response to the request of the government of South Vietnam, President Eisenhower sent economic aid and military equipment to assist the people of South Vietnam in their efforts to prevent a communist takeover.
For over 11 years, North Vietnam and South Vietnam had been at war to determine the future of their country. On April 30th, 1975, that future was determined. For 1.7 million people, that future was a hell on earth.
Headline, South Vietnam surrenders and the communists occupy Saigon. We have a dramatic film of the evacuation of Americans and Vietnamese from Saigon. You said you will ask Congress for funds to care for as many as 70,000 Vietnamese refugees. And tonight's comment on the future of Indochina. Harry?
On March 28th, South Vietnam and U.S. forces began the evacuation of Da Nang, one of the last remaining northern cities not in the hands of the communists. On March 29th, the U.S. and South Vietnam lost Da Nang to the North Vietnamese. North Vietnam continued to mobilize south towards Saigon, relentlessly eradicating remaining South Vietnamese assets. On the 30th of April 1975, North Vietnam took down the U.S. Embassy's gates and gave way for the future of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The United States pulled its last people out of Saigon by helicopter, and then began to evacuate South Vietnamese citizens. South Vietnamese military pilots began flying out of the city and over to U.S. carriers and destroyers on the coast. At sea, soldiers were struggling to take the continual flow of refugees aboard. To allow for a more rapid and safe approach, helicopters were deliberately pushed overboard or crashed into the ocean. Millions of people were left behind as the last U.S. helicopters and planes departed from Saigon. Their desperation to live a life free of fear brought them to the edge of deadly waters. An estimated 2 million Vietnamese people had to use boats and ships to leave Vietnam. Almost all the vessels used were fishing boats, not intended for the massive distances required to escape to a better future. Refugee vessels commonly went south, east, north, and more often west. 110,000 Vietnamese sought refuge in the Philippines and Hong Kong. Over 200,000 refugees headed west towards Thailand and Malaysia. A minority of refugees were willing to make the attempt to venture out into the Pacific towards the west coast of Canada and the United States. Most of the refugees were unable to bring proper supplies. Some survived by burning their own belongings as a mean of heat, and others survived on the desperate act of cannibalism. The oceans refugees traveled were unforgiving, leaving enormous amounts of vessels damaged or destroyed. Spaces on board boats were crammed. There were too many people and too little supply of what they needed. Starvation, dehydration, murder, and death ran rampant throughout the journeys of thousands. In the end, near 200,000 Vietnamese boat people were killed by the seas or the desperation for human survival.
Overseas, at the beginning of another week, the Vietnamese boat people are getting more help from the international community. West German merchant ships have picked up 371 off the southeast coast of Malaysia.
Those lucky enough to find a ship or land were brought into multiple refugee camps and were processed for immigration and citizenship. In an effort to reduce as many people as possible from suffering under communist tyranny, the US initiated multiple programs to provide the Vietnamese with a route of escape. One of the most iconic rescue missions, known as Operation Baby Lift, allowed over 10,000 Vietnamese children an opportunity to take advantage of the freedoms in America. Operation Baby Lift is best known for the C-5 Galaxy crash, resulting in hundreds of deaths consisting of soldiers, children, and crew. Other foreign nations intervened as well, to try and keep refugees from overwhelming the few nations in Asia willing to assist.
8 months ago, Malaysia became fed up with refugees. Navy gunboats have towed thousands of refugees like these out to sea to uncertain fate.
France had begun to intercept boats in order to bring them to Europe and other nations willing to provide for the refugees. Anti-immigration protests broke out in Australia in response to the large amounts of refugees from Vietnam. Australia's government remained open to the idea of allowing Vietnamese refugees in, eventually giving 50,000 refugees a residence in Australia. The United States had flown in hundreds of thousands of refugees from the Pacific. By the end of the 20th century, America had accepted 800,000 Vietnamese refugees into its borders. While most refugees had begun to arrive in other nations by sea or aircraft, many were still on the ground looking for a way out of Vietnam. 235,000 refugees fled to Thailand and Cambodia, eventually taking residence in refugee camps. Cambodia and Thailand became immigration hubs and rapidly established camps and provided supplies. The North Vietnamese had established dominance in all of Vietnam and reunited the South and North. South Vietnamese politicians were executed, and many citizens unable to escape were used to construct infrastructure and provide to the agricultural industry. The new government required the South Vietnamese to attend re-educational facilities in an attempt to stifle as much democratic resilience as possible.
The last time these Vietnamese began a journey, their chances of surviving were 50-50. Now they say it was worth all the agony and the waiting, especially since America is the final destination.
The United States now has over 1.4 million Vietnamese citizens. Today, multiple Vietnamese cultural revolutions have occurred within the U.S., ingraining their world into ours. The United States has begun to re-establish alliances and economic partnerships, pushing through to a better future.
This week, Commander H.B. Lay and his ship made the latest in a series of goodwill visits to Vietnam.
Next to President Obama's historic visit to Vietnam, for so long a bitter enemy of America, the president with smiles and a handshake with Vietnam.
Multiple refugees have decided to journey back to Vietnam to find their families or to discover what remains of their history. Today, Vietnam has one of the fastest growing economies and is beginning to look into preserving their future with a possible democratic government.